Hi everyone, good evening and welcome to today's session. So, from wherever you're watching me from, I want to say good evening, good morning, good afternoon. We already have our instructor on the call. Hi Timothy, good evening. It's good to have you here again.
Yes, thank you very much, Mwamaka. Good evening. Good evening to you and good evening to everybody.
Yes. So before we go on, Timothy is the lead front-end engineer at Seamless HR, and he'll be anchoring our class for today. So that I don't take much into the class, Timothy, you can go ahead and start your class. There'll be comments. If there are questions, it will be dropped in the comment section, and I'll let you know.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, so
So over to you.
all right, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this class. My name is Timothy Okobo, and I'm one of the lead front-end engineers at Seamless HR. Okay, so I'm going to be sharing my screen. Just a second. Okay, seems that my, let's see. Um,
So hi guys, I think our instructor. Oh, okay. Okay, he's back now.
Um,
Hi, Timothy. Welcome back.
yes. Yeah, thank you very much. I needed to set up permissions so that I can share my screen.
Oh, all right.
Yes. Just a moment. Okay. All right. So once again, welcome everyone to this class. And today I'm going to be taking a session on lists, keys, and use effect. Um, I've been working as a front-end engineer since 2019, and I can tell you for a fact that everything that we're going to learn in this class are things that you are going to be applying on a daily basis as a front-end engineer. So irrespective of the kind of application that you're building, whether it's a fintech application or a health tech application, or even an e-commerce application, you are going to have to apply the lessons that are going to be shared in this class. So, for instance, in a health tech application, you would want to list a set of medical records, or in an e-commerce application, you would want to list a set of products that users can browse through and add to cart. So listing items, making API calls, managing side effects, these are part and parcel of everything that a front-end engineer does on a daily basis. So in this class, I'm going to be sharing best practices with listing, rendering items in a React application, and managing states, and managing side effects with use effects. If there are any questions, you can always drop them on the chat, and I'm going to attend to them. To follow along in this class, I mean, you could set up a React application with Vite. You could set up a React application with Vite, just to follow along with this class, in case you want to, code along. So to create an application with Vite, you can just npm create Vite at latest, and choose a React template, and you should be up and running. So in React, one of the things that you have to do is working with data structures. And one of the data structures that you have to work with is an array. All right. So right here, I have an example where we have an array containing JavaScript frameworks, right? So to render this list of items on the UI, you use the map array method. Now, one of the prerequisites to learning React is having a very good foundation in vanilla JavaScript. And when you learn vanilla JavaScript, you get to learn about array methods like map, like filter, like reduce. Okay, so in listing items on the UI, rendering items on the UI, one of the array methods that gets to be used is the map array method. Just to showcase that, I have a React, an empty React application set up here, and let's say that I have this. Let's say I have this data structure that I need to render on the UI. All I have to do is to create, list items, and I could do JavaScript frameworks, the map, and I can get the framework, right? And then I could return an li element, and then, framework.name, right? And then I could just render a UL, and then list items. and that's it. So rendering a list of items in React is very simple. It's very straightforward. It's just using the map array method. And as you can see, there are several use cases to this. You could have a list of products in an e-commerce application, and you just use the array map method to loop through each item and just render them on the UI. Okay. Later on, we're going to see the impact of this prop here called a key. Apart from using the map array method, there are times when you're working on a React application and you need to filter a list of items. You're not just getting a list of items and rendering them on the UI. You also want to be able to filter some items before you render them on the UI. Once again, just like in vanilla JavaScript, where you use the filter array method to select certain items from your entire list, you could do the same thing in React. So for example, in this structure that we have, you can see that we have a couple of JavaScript frameworks, right? And then there's this property called isFrontend, which is a Boolean. So React is a front-end framework, Vue is a front-end framework, but Express.js is not a front-end framework. So let's say I have a task where I need to render just the front-end JavaScript frameworks. Okay, all I have to do is apply the filter array method and filter just the ones where the framework is a front end, and then take the results of that, map through it, and render the entire result on the UI. So if I have to apply the same thing here, let's say I want to only filter just the front-end frameworks, right? On the screen, all I have to do is to apply a little bit of filter to this. So I could say front-end frameworks is equal to JavaScript frameworks dot filter. And then give me just the framework where is front end is true. And now I can use the result of front end frameworks in my map to get just the front end frameworks. And now the entire list is filtered, just rendering only the frameworks that is front end is set to true. So that's pretty much it with regards to listing items in a React application. You just leverage the map array method and then loop through the items and render them on the UI. However, when working with lists, there's something that is quite important, and that has to do with ensuring that each item in the list can be uniquely identified by React. Now, what do I mean? Let's say we have 5 items that we want to render on the UI. And it's possible there could be a delete functionality. So a user there could be a cancel button where a user can delete one of the items from the list. Now, it's very important that each of the items on the list can be uniquely identified. And the way you get to do that is passing a key prop. The question then is, why is the key prop important? Now, without the key prop, anytime one of the items gets deleted, what React will have to do is re-render the entire component just to be able to render the updated UI on the screen. And that's not very good for performance, because imagine you have like 1,000 items on the UI. And then anytime one of the items gets updated or gets deleted, React has to re-render the component just to render the remaining, the remaining items on the UI. That's not very good. So what we then do as developers is ensuring that anytime we have to render list of items on the UI, each of those items needs to be passed a key prop. Okay, that way React optimizes the rendering, optimizes the performance during re-renders. And there are best practices to this. There are best practices to rendering lists in React. Okay, one of them, like I said, is passing a key to each list item. Now, if we go back to the previous example that I wrote, as you can see, I don't even have a key yet. Now, if I check the console, there should be a warning somewhere from React. Aha. So there's a warning somewhere from React telling me each child in a list should have a unique key prop. Right? So all I have to do is go ahead and pass a key and say framework dot name. And when I go back and I refresh the page, I shouldn't have that warning, that error anymore. And that's very vital. That's very vital. Without the key prop, it becomes very difficult for React to optimize the performance of your application. However, there are times when as a front-end engineer, you have a list of items and you know that you need to pass a key to each item, but you actually end up passing the key prop to each item, but you don't do it the right way. So what do I mean? In addition to passing a key to your list of items, you have to make sure that each key in the list is unique. Each key in the list is unique. So for example, currently I'm using framework.name as the key. But what this is only valid if each of the names is unique. So for example, if I change this to React, then using the name as the key is no longer a valid solution. As you can see, React once again is complaining. It says encounter 2 children with the same key, React.js. So in addition to passing a key to every item, you have to make sure that those keys are going to be unique. Now, most of the time in practice, when you are fetching data from, let's say, an API, most of the time the backend engineers would have added an ID, right? A unique ID, to each of the items in your list. That ID is unique and it's best used for, is best used as the key in your list item. Okay, so in this case, I can just change this to framework.id. And then that error should be gone. Right? So the key point here is that you have to pass a key to your list items, and the keys you pass have to be unique. Now, there's another gotcha where you would see some applications where developers use the array index as the key. That's not a good practice. By array index, this is what I mean. As I'm looping through over here on line 20, where I'm looping through with map, I can actually get the index of each item. That's the position of each item. And then I can use that position as the key. This could work. There might be no error on the console, right? But this is prone to bugs. In a situation where you have like cancel buttons to delete items, then the application becomes very buggy, because this is it. Let's say you have 5 items and then you are using the position of each item as the key. So item 1 has a key of 1, item 2 has a key of 2, and things like that. When one item is removed, what happens? The item that is the second item then becomes the first item. The item that was the third item then becomes the second item. So what would have to happen is that React would have to reshuffle your entire list of items just to re-render the application, and that's very bad for performance. And that's one of the reasons why using array index as keys is not very ideal. Another very important point to note is that when choosing what your key should be, you have to make sure that your key is stable across render. Stable across render. In other words, whenever the component re-renders, let's say props has changed or state has changed, the keys of your list items should remain the same. And one of the ways that can be violated is using dates.now. I've seen some applications where the key item, right, on the key prop on each list item is generated on the fly, like using date.now. And that's not very good, right? Because each key prop has to be stable across re-render. So you have to avoid generating your keys during render, and instead include them on your data. Include them on your data. Like in this case, we have our data set already, and the key that we are using, if I take this back and just use framework.id. So the key that we are using already exists in the data structure. All right, that's a valid thing to take note. So these are some of the best practices with working with list or rendering list in a React application. You have to make sure that you pass a key prop. You have to make sure that you avoid using array index as keys, and you have to make sure that your keys are stable across render. Do not generate your keys on the fly, right? Ensure that they already exist on your data. But then a question pops up. What happens if you have a data that for some reason there seems not to be any property that is unique? Okay, like in this case where we have, name as React, and name as Express. You can't use framework.name here. So what happens? What happens if your data doesn't have any unique property? Now that's if you are fetching data from an API, then you most likely have something that is unique, like the ID, for example. But let's say for some reason you do not have a unique property. One of the things you can do on the front end is to generate an ID on your data before you start, using before you start rendering the list items on the UI. And one of the ways to do that is to use something called crypto.random UUID. So you could use crypto.random UUID on the front end, just in case you don't have anything that is unique. And then,
Hi, Timothy.
okay.
Sorry to cut in, but please, can you zoom your code screen, your
Oh, okay.
visual code screen? You can
Oh,
zoom in a
okay.
bit. Thank you.
All right. I think this is better.
Yes, this is better.
Okay. Thank you. So, so as I was saying, let's say for some reason you don't have anything that is unique in your data. What you can do on the front end is to generate a unique ID using crypto.random UUID. Another option that you could do on the front end is to, you could npm install the UUID package, and then you could just go ahead and use the UUID package to generate an ID. But you have to make sure that the ID is not generated on the fly. Like, for example, you have to make sure you're not coming over here to say, crypto.random UUID. This is not very good because you are generating the ID on the fly. So across renders, the ID is going to be different. Okay, the ID is going to be different. So anytime you have to generate an ID on the front end, you could use the UUID package from npm, or you could generate the ID directly on your data using the random UUID method. Okay. So these are all the best practices with rendering list items. So going back to, yeah, so I've already demonstrated this already. So just applying the best practices in the data structure that I'm using here. Name is already unique, so I'm just using that as the key. I'm avoiding index. I'm avoiding generating keys on the fly, and I already have a unique property in my data structure that I am using as my key prop on each list item. And that's it for working with list in a React application. It's very simple. You just have one method called map that you can use, and if you have to filter, if you have to select certain items, you can just use filter and make sure you apply unique stable keys on each list item. Now, the next part of this class is about side effects, use effects. Before jumping into use effects, it's very important for us to take some time and understand what a side effect is. So in your React application, what's a side effect, and how do you create a side effect, and how do you even manage a side effect? A side effect is any operation that steps out of your React component to interact with an external system. So anytime you have to, step out of your React code to interact with an external system, then you are performing a side effect. So for example, manipulating the DOM using, say, document.query selector, that's a side effect because you are stepping out of your React world, your React component, and you are stepping into the world of the DOM, right? Document object model, to access elements from the DOM. That's a side effect. Fetching data from an API is a side effect. Why? Because you are stepping out of your React component to a server to fetch some data from an API, to fetch data from a database. That's a side effect. Using local storage, local storage or get item, local storage or set item, that's a side effect. Why? Because you are stepping out of the world of React, your React component, into the browser to leverage a browser API, to either store or retrieve data. That's a side effect. Setting up timers, like set timeout. Okay, apply this, execute this code after 1 second or after 5 seconds. That's a side effect. Why? Set timeout, set interval, they are all browser APIs. So every time you have to, step out of your React component to perform any external interaction, you are performing a side effect. However, there's another kind of side effect that doesn't necessarily involve you stepping out of your React component, and that is calling set state during render. Okay, I'm going to explain each of these. I'm going to demonstrate each of these so that it syncs better. So the first one was manipulating the DOM, right? Manipulating the DOM, that's a side effect. Fetching data from an API, that's a side effect. However, because we are saying these are side effects, it doesn't necessarily mean that side effects themselves are bad. Side effects are not bad. But what is bad, or what can be bad, are how you manage side effects. For example, almost every application has to fetch data from an API. If you visit an e-commerce application, they have to fetch the products. They're fetching that from an API. That's a side effect. But it's good because it can be good or bad depending on how it has been written on the code base, right? So in this in the next couple of minutes, we're going to see how to ensure that we are able to manage side effects properly in our React application. There is a golden rule to managing side effects in React. And most of the time, even experienced developers sometimes, forget about this, and they spend minutes or even hours debugging. And that is this: code executed during render should not have any side effects. Code executed during render should not have any side effects. What do I mean? Let's go back to our application. I'm going to so by code executed during render, I'm talking about code before the return statement. So everything here, okay, should not have any side effects. So for example, let's say I have a div with a card, and then I have an ID, and the ID is card. And then let's say I want to access this ID. Sorry, I want to access this div with a card. and then I come directly here and I say const card document dot query selector, and then I say console.log card. Let's see what that gives us on the UI. Okay. So if you notice, what I get is null. And that's surprising because I actually have a div with a card, with an ID of card, but I am accessing it and I'm getting null. I'm getting nothing. Okay. Now, what's happening here is that every code here, before the return statement, every code here is executed during what is called the render phase. And every code in that section should never have a side effect. Now, this is a side effect because, like we explained, I'm stepping out of my React component into the DOM to try to access, an element. I shouldn't have to do that. Another example of a side effect could be me. Say, let's say I have a state called age, and then I have set age, and then use state. Let's say the age is 10, and directly in the render phase, I say set age, 20, and then I render age. This is a problem because directly within the render phase, I am updating state. Now, if I go back to my application, you can see what we have here. React is even shouting. It's saying too many re-renders. React limits the number of renders to prevent an infinite loop. So what happens when you violate this golden rule is that your application becomes prone to bugs, and you stand the chance of having an infinite loop, and that can be very problematic for your React application. So as much as possible, you want to make sure that code executed, mind you, I'm using the word executed, not initialized, right? So for example, we're going to see how to manage this side effects on the next slide. But because I directly have document or query selector here, it's going to be executed by React. Because I have axios.get here, it's going to be directly executed by React. And because I have set age here, it's going to be directly executed by React. All of these side effects should not have to happen within the render phase, or else the application becomes prone to bugs. So we've established the fact that side effects are not bad in themselves, but what can be bad is how they are managed. And they are not bad because every application needs them. Every application needs to, make an API call or set a timer and things like that. But then, what is the recommended way of managing side effects in a React application? There are basically two ways. One of them is using event handlers, and another is using UseEffects. Okay, and you use an event handler when the side effect is triggered by a user interaction. So for example, if I go back to this example and say I have a button called select card, and then on click, I have a function called select card. And then const select card, and then I move this inside, and then console.log card, right? So now what has happened is that I have moved this side effect inside of a function that gets triggered when a user clicks on the button. Now, if I go back to the UI, and then I click on the button, I get the result that I actually want. Initially, we were getting null, but and that felt like a bug because I know that there's a div in my code with an ID of card. Okay, so one of the ways of managing side effects in a React application is, moving user triggered side effects inside of event handlers. But in a situation where your side effect needs to run automatically when the page loads or when the component, mounts, you move that piece of code inside of a use effect. So for example, going back to this use case, let's say I want to access the card without a user interaction. The moment the component loads, I want to access the card. We've seen that putting it directly on the render phase is a side effect and can cause issues, can cause bugs. So what then do we do? React has a special hook called UseEffects. And the way it works is that you call UseEffect and then you pass a callback function to it. And then I can place that piece of code there. And let me just put an empty array here. I'm going to come back and explain what this does. So if I refresh the page and I do this, I get back my card. This is different from the null that we got earlier, where we just add, we're accessing the DOM directly in the render phase. So these are the two ways of managing side effects in a React application. It's either you are accessing, you're executing the side effect by a user triggered action, like an on click, on focus, on mouse over, or you are executing the side effect inside of a special React hook called a use effect. In this case, for example, I'm making an API call to an API to fetch some posts, and I have that inside of a side effect. All right, this is way better than putting this piece of code directly in the render phase. So we've seen what a use effect is. A use effect is a React hook for performing side effects. Simply put, it's a React hook for performing side effects. And then what are the use cases for use effects? Fetching data from an API is a very good use case for use effect. Setting up timers. So let's say you want to perform an operation after 5 seconds, right, without a user interaction. On mounted, once the component mounts, you want to be able to perform an operation after a specific time. Use effect is a very, very good place for you to do that. Or let's say you want to set up subscriptions. What does that mean? So subscriptions could mean that, okay, anytime, if you've used I don't know the experience level of everyone on the call, but if you've used something like Supabase or Firebase for building an application and you have like your authentication, right? It's possible that you want to do something when a user logs out or when a user logs in. So whenever the authentication state changes, you want to subscribe to that state. Or it could be a database that anytime there is a create operation on the database, anytime data gets added to the database, you want to set up a listener, a subscription, okay, so that anytime that operation happens, you want to do something. A very good place to put that piece of code that sets up subscriptions is inside of a use effect. And like we saw earlier, accessing the DOM unmounted is a very good use case for use effect. So let's just see the example of use effect for data fetching, right? Going back to this, I could say use effect, and did GitHub has an API for fetching GitHub profiles, right? I could use that to, okay, I don't have, let's quickly npm install Axios. So Axios is an npm package for making API calls very, very well. If you don't want to use Axios, you could use the built-in fetch, the built-in fetch function from that is built into the browser. So I could do import Axios from Axios, and then I could say axios.get. And so there's a particular API that is public for fetching GitHub profiles, right? And that's https github.com/search/users. All right, and it takes a query param. It takes a query param for location. So I could say the location is Lagos. Okay, and then I could say then give me the response and log the response. And let me just put an empty array here. We're going to come back to what this empty array that we keep adding to our use effect implies. So if I check my networks tab, I hope I got that. API correctly. github.com/search/users. Oh, I see where the issue is coming from. This should have been equals to. Let's see. I think I see. It's api.github.com. Okay, so yeah, so api.github.com was the correct endpoint. So if you look at this, all I'm basically doing here is I'm making an API call for all the GitHub users that are based in Lagos, and it's showing me a couple of Nigerians. So there's Onyedika Benjamin, Ogunsola Adebayo, Samuel Okoro, right? Bat Coda, Ruth. And I'm doing this directly inside of a use effect. So I'm making an API call inside of a use effect. And the reason why I'm doing that inside of a use effect is because making APIs is a side effect. I am reaching out to an external system. I'm stepping out of the realm of my React component into some external system to interact with it. In this case, to fetch GitHub users that are based in Lagos. And I'm doing that directly within a use effect. So this is one of the very common use cases of use effect, which is fetching data from an API. But there is more to use effect, right? There is more to use effect. If you've been writing React for over 2 years, you would know that one of the most confused API or one of the most confused feature in React is use effect, because it's very, very easy to write some use effect code that causes bugs that you don't even know why the bug is happening in the first place. So one of the things I would like to spend the next few minutes to explain is, when does the code inside of your use effect run? So coming back to this example, I have two use effect code here. I have this one where I'm sort of accessing the DOM to retrieve the card element, and I have this one where I am making an API call to GitHub, right? Now the question is, when does this code run? When does React execute this code? And the answer is, it depends. It depends, and it depends on this guy here. So use effect, it takes this argument. This first argument is a callback function. But then there's another argument here, which in this case, I passed an empty array to it. Now, let's say I didn't pass an empty array to this guy. Let's say I didn't pass an empty array to that use effect. If I go back to the UI and then I refresh and I go back to the console, I still see the card there. However, let's say I have a state, like in this case, I have the age state, and then let me change. Okay, let me just create a new button. Create a new button called updates. Let's change this to a count and set count. So by default, let the count be 0. And then let this be increment count. And then on click, I can say set count, give me the previous count. And then previous count plus 1. So every time you click on the increment button, I just want to increment the count. And then let's render what the updated count is. Okay, so let's just see if our counter application is working. So I click on it and then the count increases. However, let's go back to the console. So if you notice, every time I click on increment count, we get card logged to the console. In other words, every time I change this state, the code in this use effects gets called. And that's because, going back to my slide, without a dependency array, code inside use effect runs on mount. And anytime state or props change. So what that means is, because I don't have an array passed as a second argument, because I don't have this, the moment my component mounts, the code in my use effect will be called as it is. And anytime the component changes its state, the code in that use effect will be called. So that's one. But what about when I have an empty array? An empty array passed as a second argument. So if I go back and then I do this, okay, so let's see how that changes everything. If I reload the page, I have my card rendered, but I'm changing states now. I'm incrementing the count, and that card is no longer rendered. So what happens is, because I'm passing an empty dependency array, so this array here is called a dependency array. Because it is empty, React is only calling the code I have in my use effect just once, unmounted. The next one is, with a dependency array containing one or more states and props, code inside use effect runs unmounted and when the dependencies change. In other words, if I come here and I say count, right? What I'm telling React is, I want you to call this code when this component is rendered on the screen for the first time. However, anytime count changes, I also want you to call this code. If any other thing changes in my application, any other state changes, no need for you to call this. But anytime count changes, I want you to call the code that I have in here. So if I go back and I reload the page, I get, my div on the console for the first time, and every time I change state, Every time I change that count variable, React calls the code inside of my UseEffect again. So these are, so the question of when does code inside of a UseEffect get called? The answer is it depends. It depends on the second argument. If it is absent, then React will have to call your code when the component is mounted and every time state changes or props change. If you have that array but it is empty, then the code in the UseEffect only gets called on mounted. If there are states attached to the added to the array, then the code in the UseEffect will be called when the component is mounted and anytime those specific states or props, those dependencies are updated. Another very important thing with UseEffect is what is known as a cleanup function. A cleanup function. Now, there are times when you can have a side effect inside of your React code that if you're not careful, it can lead to what is known as memory leaks, or it can even lead to unexpected bugs. All right, so for example, in this case, you could have like a set timeout. So in other words, after 1 second, I want you to do something. And you could just, that could be the only thing in your UseEffect code, but that gives room to bugs. That gives room to bugs like data leakage, memory leaks, and all sorts. You could even have a set interval. You could say after every 1 second, interval, do something. And you could this could be the only code in your UseEffect, but that's prone to bugs. Or you could have like a subscription. Okay, every time a user is registered on my database, listen for that change and do something. And you could that could be the only code in your UseEffect, but that's prone to bugs. So for side effects like timers and subscriptions, it's very, very important to do a cleanup. It's very important to do a cleanup. And the way you do a cleanup inside of your side effect is to just return a function. Just return a function. In the case of set timeout has a corresponding cleanup function called clear timeout. This is just JavaScript. That has nothing to do with React. Set interval also has clear interval. So all you have to do is return a function that calls clear timeout and then passes the timer ID. Return a function that calls clear interval and that passes an interval ID. So working with UseEffects goes beyond just knowing that UseEffects can be used for data fetching and side effects. But as a competent front-end engineer, you need to understand these best practices. If I have a UseEffect that performs some sort of timing or subscription, it becomes very, very important to do a cleanup in order to avoid memory leaks and any unexpected bug in your application. Now, if you're a very curious front-end engineer, which is very important if you want to grow and be better than your peers, one of the things you need to do is to be able to ask questions that are very, questions that will open more insights to what is going on. And one of the questions you could ask is, when does this cleanup function get called? When does React call your cleanup function? Right? Okay, I don't have that in my slide, but let me just explain. React calls your cleanup function on two occasions. The first occasion is when your component on mounts. Okay, so when the component on mounts, in other words, when the component is taken away, when in this case, I have an app component. So when this app component is unmounted, when it is taken away from the DOM, right, then React gets to call that cleanup function. Another time that React calls the cleanup function is just before it invokes the UseEffect. We've looked at 3 ways that React can execute the code inside of its UseEffect. just before React calls the code inside of that use effect, one of the things React does is to check if that use effect has a cleanup function, and then it goes ahead to call it. We can demonstrate that. So I have a use effect here that just logs card. Let's add some sort of dummy cleanup function. So I could say return console.log cleanup. Okay, so let's see when this function is going to be called. If I go back to my browser, now the first time unmounted, if I refresh again, the very first time what happens is the use effect got called and then the cleanup got called. But now, subsequently, as I update state just before React invokes the code, executes the code in the use effect, it first of all cleans up, right? It cleans up and then calls the code in the use effect. It cleans up, calls the code in use effect. Okay, so and that's very important to prevent any form of bugs or any form of stale data, any form of memory leaks. Okay, so after the component has mounted, React calls your cleanup function to prepare the way before it then executes code that is within your use effect. And that's very, very critical. In the absence of this cleanup function, when you have certain side effects in your use effect, you could have some memory leaks and some bugs that you could spend days trying to fix. So in summary, when working with list of items, you just use the map array method, and you are good to go. However, you have to make sure that you pass a unique and a stable key to each list item. You have to make sure you do not forget the golden rule to managing side effects in a React application, and that is, do not perform side effects directly within the render phase. Instead, move your side effects to use effect or to an event handler. You use an event handler if one of the users of your application needs to do something to trigger the side effect to run. Let's say they have to click on a button, they have to hover on something, then you can move that side effect into an event handler. But if your side effect needs to run automatically unmounted, move the side effect inside of use effect. And don't forget to clean up your side effects, such as timers and subscriptions, because if you don't do that, you stand the chance of subjecting your application to memory leaks and some very, very weird bugs. So what could be the next step? The next step is for you to challenge yourself to building something. There's not enough time on the call for us to look at each of these best practices and then build an application. But if you notice, one of the things that I did was that I leveraged this GitHub API to sort of like list GitHub profiles. You can take the data. If you look at this, we have an array called items. You can leverage the lessons we've learned to render these items, list these items on the UI. And there are a couple of very interesting properties that you can render. I can see the avatar URL, which is like the picture of someone. Okay, you could render the person's name, the developer's name, and render the developer's URL, the avatar. Okay, and leverage use effects like I did to fetch the data and then go about listing the items using array.map. So that's pretty much what this class is about. Don't forget about the best practices that I emphasize. They are very, very important. And as you go about building something with this, all the things that we've learned in this class is going to sink in. and you'll be able to apply them on your day-to-day job as a front-end engineer. Thank you. I can't see any chat on any questions on the chat, but if there are questions, you can drop them in so that I can attend to them. Hi, Uamaka.
Hi, Timothy.
Yes.
So I know my network took me off for a bit, but I'm back now. I guess you're done. But you have some questions though.
Oh, okay. I can see a question on my on the chat. Do you have access to
Okay, I
them or
think you're
so? I
in
don't know why.
private. Go to comments. Yes,
Oh,
I
okay, okay,
can.
okay, okay. Oh, okay. First to
Yeah.
comment, do we now see if the instructor can zoom in? Okay, I did that. Is there an alternative to use? How do I? Okay, is there an alternative to use effect? Oh, yes, yes. There are alternatives to use effect, and one of them is something called TanStack query. One of them is something called TanStack query. Um, TanStack query is a very powerful library for performing side effects like data fetching in a React application. And there is also something called use. There is a new um, React hook called use that you can also use to perform data fetching in your React application. But in production, TanStack query is highly used because when it comes to data fetching, there are a couple of things that are very important. One of them is caching. Caching. So, for example, let's say your application fetches data for a user, and then they leave that page and then they come back almost immediately. What could happen is that your application could still go ahead and fetch that data again. But with TanStack query, you get caching for free, right? So it helps solve a lot of user experience issues that you might not be able to do, or if you have to do it inside of UseEffects, you have to write a lot of code to do. How do I create a dependency array? Yes, I already demonstrated that. So you create your dependency array as the second argument of your UseEffect. So if you look at my UseEffect, the first argument is this function, and then I create my dependency array as the second argument. I could leave it empty. Meaning I want React to call this code unmounted. Or I could put some states and props here, telling React that in addition to calling this code unmounted, I also want you to call this code anytime count changes. So it's very simple to create your dependency array. Any other questions? I think that those are the only two questions on the chart.
Yes, I believe those are the only two questions on chat. I think the others are easy enough to understand, but if they don't, maybe when they watch the videos, they'll have more questions
Yeah.
to ask, and they can always reach out to you on LinkedIn.
Oh, sure. Sure, they can.
All right. Yes.
And I
So
could
I think
also
that will be all.
share slides with you. Maybe you can, I don't know, is there like a community where you have access to the students to share some things with them? I could share the slide with you and you can give it to them.
Yes, we have a community, a Discord community, so I can easily get it from here and then post it there as well so that they can go through it.
All right, I'll do that.
All right. So I think that will be all for tonight. So thank you so much, Timothy, for doing this. It's great to
You're
have you
welcome.
here once again.
You're welcome.
All right.
Thank you.
So have a lovely evening ahead. Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Oh wait, someone asked one more question.
Okay, for libraries like TurnStack, how do I import them into my React project? Yes, it's very simple. So when you go to TurnStack, um, when you go to TurnStack, there is, so if you go to TurnStack, you can You can go to read the docs. So there is a documentation there for you. Um, yes. So if you go to the installation part, you can see you just do npm install the same way I did npm install Axios. You can just do npm install tanstack query. So I could copy this, for example, and just go and npm install tanstack query, and that would install the tanstack library in my React application. And you can just follow the instructions on. There's a quick start here, and if you look at this, a couple of things are imported from tanstack query, and then gets to be used. So it's very, very straightforward. Just go to the documentation, follow the installation guide and the quick start guide, and you'll be up and running. All right.
Okay. I think that's all then. Thank you so much again, once again.
Yeah, you're welcome. Have a good day.
All right, guys. So have a
Yeah,
lovely night
bye.
and all right. Bye. So guys, your attendance is in the chat. Go ahead and fill it as we end the class. Thank you. Bye everyone.